Have you ever felt like you were searching for something sacred, only to realize that the further you went, the emptier you became? You tried religion, you tried meditation, you read books, listened to podcasts, signed up for healing workshops, and yet, when night falls and you lie in silence, something still feels missing. It cannot be named or defined. It is simply an emptiness, as if your soul is waiting for someone to return. Carl Jung once stood exactly in that place. In a modern world that worships science, he quietly stepped into a path that no one else dared to take, a journey to enter into dialogue with God, not through belief, but through the unconscious, not the God of religion, but the God of symbols, a God who speaks through dreams, through images, through pain, through the very fabric of your life. In this video, we follow Carl Jung into one of the most profound and silent dimensions of human experience, the longing to be connected to the sacred and the journey back to the self, where God has always been waiting. Carl Jung was a psychoanalyst, but he was never merely that. He was a man who crossed the threshold between psychology and theology, between science and mysticism, not through dogma, but through raw, living experience, often so disorienting and chaotic that it made a man question whether he was losing his mind. In 1913, on a train ride from Zurich to Schaffhausen, Jung encountered a vision he could not explain, not with medical training, not with Freud's theories of the psyche, and certainly not with reason. It was a great flood, waters rising, swallowing all of Europe. Corpses drifting in the mud, cities destroyed, screams muffled beneath the surface. And then, from those murky waters, a tree of life arose. At the time, Jung did not think he had touched a sacred layer of reality. He was terrified. He believed he was entering psychosis, the very state he had spent years treating in others. But months later, World War I broke out, and Jung understood. What he had seen was not a pathological hallucination, but a warning from deep within the collective unconscious, the ancient psychic layer that humanity shares. A door had opened. It was a turning point, and also a point of no return. From being a doctor, Jung stepped into what he called a dialogue with the soul, a process neither comfortable nor bright, and certainly not healing, in the aestheticized way we often see it today. Jung wrote, "We do not come to the spiritual by way of teaching. We come to it through a numinous experience, an encounter with the sacred that cannot be named, but which we know is beyond reason. Such an experience may arise in the face of death, in a recurring dream that unsettles you to your core, in the presence of a symbol, a cross, a mandala, or the eyes of a child, that awakens something within." Jung did not define God as an old man in the clouds. God, in his system, was a symbol of the self, the wholeness, the center, the reconciler of all opposites within. To reach God, you do not need to go to church. You need only to listen to your own unconscious. This is where Jung's philosophy becomes dangerous, in the best sense. He does not hand you a ready-made faith. He hands you a map, one that leads inward, and he says, "Who looks outside dreams. Who looks inside awakens." Why then, if not religious, did he emphasize the divine? Because without an inner sacred principle to orient us, we become lost in the very machinery of our intellect. We replace God with politics, with money, with romantic love, or with an inflated ego. And when the center of our being is not grounded in something deeper than ego, we become controlled by it, through illusions of control, power, and immortality. Jung was not against science. He merely warned, a psychology without a spiritual dimension is a soulless system. It treats symptoms but abandons the soul. That is why he spent the final decades of his life studying ancient texts, from alchemy and the Kabbalah to Taoist philosophy. Not because he was superstitious, but because he understood symbols, not concepts, are the language of the soul. You dream of a snake. You repeat the same painful patterns in love. You are haunted by an image and cannot explain why. Jung would not ask you, "What's your problem?" He would ask, "What is this symbol saying to you? What invitation from the depths of your being are you refusing to hear?" In that journey, each of us must encounter the divine in our own way, not a God outside of us, but the sacred presence within, which we have forgotten in the noise of modern life. Jung called this the pilgrimage to the self, a return not to social identity, but to the center of being, the self, deeper than every name, every role, and every wound. When we speak of God, Jung suggests we must begin not with doctrine, but with dreams. He once said, "Dreams are the letters God sends us each night. But the problem is, we do not know how to read them, because God, or more precisely, the self, does not write with words. The divine speaks in symbols. Imagine this. You are dreaming. In the dream, you fall into a dark cave. There, a coiled snake is watching you. You wake up in panic, heart pounding, palms sweaty. Your first reaction? What a strange dream. Your second reaction? I must be stressed. Or, if you lean slightly spiritual, you might search online. What does it mean to dream of a snake? But if you follow Jung's path, you would not do that. You would sit down, open your journal, and ask, what does this snake represent within me? Where is it alive in my soul? Has it come to frighten me or to awaken something I have buried? Jung did not treat symbols as things to be decoded. You cannot look up a dream symbol the way you look up grammar in a textbook, because symbols are not answers. They are questions posed by the unconscious. One person dreams of the ocean, and to them, it means freedom. Another dreams of the ocean, and it evokes fear of drowning. The same image, but it speaks the private language of each soul. This is what Jung sought to restore, the capacity to speak with the soul through symbol. In modern psychology, we ask, what is the problem? In Jungian psychology, we ask, what story is being told through this symptom? What symbol keeps appearing in your life that you haven't yet noticed? Symbols are gateways to the sacred. Why did ancient cultures create myths? Why did they say, Zeus is angry instead of simply, there's thunder? Why did they say, a spirit has taken hold of me instead of, I feel anxious? Because they understood something we have forgotten. Rational language cannot reach the depth of feeling and soul. Only symbols can do that. On the inner journey, symbols are both map and doorway. The more you attend to your dreams, the more you dialogue with recurring images in your life, the more you begin to realize it is the self knocking. The self, the whole, the sacred center within you constantly seeks to communicate. But it does not use logical language. It sends you images, feelings, intuition, fragments of ancient myth, a song that keeps replaying in your mind, an animal you keep encountering all week. All of these are symbols. And something strange happens when you start listening. The symbols begin to respond. God does not speak in human language. God speaks through the unconscious. Jung understood that we cannot prove God exists like a mathematical theorem. But he also said, I do not need to believe in God. I know that God exists as an inner spiritual experience. This is the numinous experience when you are overwhelmed by the sacred. No fixed image is needed, but you know something greater than the ego is present. You may call it God, or the universe, or a higher intuition. It does not matter. What matters is that you are no longer the center. You are in relationship with a higher principle. When Jung painted mandalas, those symmetrical sacred circles in the Red Book, he did not do it for creativity. He did it because the self was speaking to him through those forms, and he did only one thing. He listened. Jung once said, I have seen many people heal not because they resolved their issues, but because they learned to live with the symbols that belong to them. You do not need to find God. God is already there, in your unconscious. When you dream of wandering the desert, the divine is speaking of the dryness within. When you see yourself giving birth in a dream, something new is forming. When you stand on a bridge, transformation is underway. You don't have to understand it all. You only need reverence. Like Jung, you only need to sit down and say, I am ready to listen. When you truly begin to dialogue with the God within you, you begin returning to the self, becoming yourself in a way the world could never teach you. It is a sacred return, and it does not happen out there. It happens within you and through you. Carl Jung did not believe that life was a straight line leading toward success. He believed it was a spiraling cycle in which the human soul is constantly getting lost and then finding its way home. But home, in this sense, is not a physical place. It is the self, the most sacred and complete aspect within each individual. It is not the ego you present on social media, nor the identity you construct in order to gain acceptance from society. The self, in Jung's system, is an archetype of the divine. It is the center and the wholeness in which all opposites within you can meet, without canceling each other out. You can imagine it as a mandala, a circle in which light and shadow coexist, where reason and instinct, the wild child within and the inner sage, the person you are and the person you could become, all are present. The self does not judge you. The self does not demand that you be good. It invites you to be whole. To return to the self is to return to God, not through belief, but through lived experience. When you begin listening to your dreams, when you honor the symbols living in your unconscious, when you dare to pass through the shadow rather than hide it, you are returning to the self. And in that journey, something mysterious begins to happen. You no longer search for God outside. You begin to experience God as a part of you and yourself as a part of the divine. Jung called this state the numinous union, the merging of the individual with the sacred. Not a state of happiness, but a deep existential awakening. You no longer ask, what should I do to be loved? You begin to ask, who am I when I stop playing a role? Spiritual life is no longer an abstract concept. It becomes a living reality, vivid, with its own language, its own tears and laughter, its chaos and its peace. And on this path, you begin to marry yourself. Jung described the journey to the self as a sacred marriage, the mysterium conjunctionis. Not a marriage between you and another person, but between you and the abandoned parts of yourself. Between the busy ego and the soul that has been waiting for you all along. It is like a reunion after years of separation. You embrace the child within. You stop exiling your shadow. You pause in the middle of a noisy world, and for the first time, you hear the voice of God coming from within. And then the sacred is no longer distant. You look into a stranger's eyes and feel connection. You hear an old song and weep, not from sorrow, but from something you cannot name. You dream a strange dream and wake knowing. You have just encountered a forgotten part of your soul. You no longer ask, which God should I believe in? You begin to ask, how far have I drifted from my own soul? The self does not require your perfection. The self only asks for your presence, whole, honest, and willing. Willing to step outside the performance, willing to listen to strange symbols, willing to sit still, not to control, but to connect. When you return to the self, you do not simply find yourself. You find God, not in heaven, but in the very place you once called chaos. You begin to understand that the sacred is not something far away from you. It is something that has been waiting for you to come home. In today's world, one of the things modern people often do, sometimes unconsciously, is to split spirituality and psychology into entirely separate paths. We go to therapy to heal psychological wounds. We go to church, to temples, or to meditation retreats to find a sense of the spiritual. These two directions may seem unrelated, but for Carl Jung, they are one and the same. He spent his life trying to tell the world something that most were not yet ready to hear. There is no real psychology without the spiritual dimension, and there is no authentic spiritual path unless it passes through your own psychological depths. Where Freud stopped at libido and instinctual drives, Jung continued walking into realms Freud dismissed as superstition and modern science often regards as lacking evidence. But for Jung, what could not be measured by machines was not necessarily unreal. In fact, he believed the opposite. It is precisely in what cannot be explained by logic that we find traces of the divine. Not God as a named, visible, powerful being, but God as an existential experience, alive in the unconscious, expressed through dreams, symbols, intuition, and the numinous, something sacred that cannot be explained, only lived. When Jung spoke of God, he was speaking of something within the human being, but greater than the ego. He called it the self, the archetype of wholeness, the central organizing principle that transcends the ego, reason, and even what we usually call self. The self is the center from which the ego is born. But paradoxically, once the ego becomes too dominant, it forgets its origin and begins to act as if it owns the soul. The ego wants control. The self wants wholeness. The ego fears the dark. The self contains both light and shadow as parts of one sacred symbol. The ego seeks approval. The self only asks for truth. This is where Jung becomes dangerous and more necessary than ever. He does not offer you belief. He hands you a mirror and invites you to ask, "How long have I been living disconnected from my soul?" When you begin the work of healing, of analyzing dreams, working with symbols, confronting the shadow, you are not just solving a psychological problem. You are entering into a conversation with the sacred dimension that has long been forgotten within you. And at that moment, God ceases to be a concept. God becomes a living reality. God is not something to believe in, but a relationship to enter. Jung once said, "I do not believe in God. I know that he exists." That statement is shocking, not because it denies religion, but because it opens a third path. Not blind faith, not rejection, but relationship. That relationship is not always comfortable. It demands that you strip away assumptions, that you face your shadow, that you endure the dissolution of your ego, that you bear solitude, that you stand in the wilderness of the soul without asking a belief system to save you, because you understand, only when the old self dies can real life begin. The self does not want you to be good. The self wants you to be real. When you are honest with yourself, when you acknowledge your wounds, desires, fears, longings, your darkness, and your light, all asking to be seen and heard, you begin to live from a deeper place. From there you no longer ask, "What should I believe in?" Instead you ask, "What within me is speaking, and do I have the courage to listen?" Jung never promised peace at the end of this path. He only promised this: you will become real, and when you are real, God can live through you. Not as a distant deity, but as a deep rhythm of the universe pulsing through every decision, every ache, every true step you take. In a world increasingly fragmented where trust is breaking down and religion feels too distant or too dogmatic, Jung offers you the final sanctuary left, your own soul. And when you enter that sanctuary, with bare feet, a trembling heart, and more courage than faith, you will no longer feel alone. Not because you have found a God, but because you have found yourself, and within that self, something more sacred than all prayers. After all these years of trying, hurting, hoping to become better, maybe what you truly need is not healing. Maybe you just need to return. Return to the center of your being, where the self has always been waiting, not to judge, not to demand your perfection, but to say, "I never left. I am you, whole, deep, and sacred." In this world, you may lose belief. But never lose the conversation with your own soul, because that is not only where you find God, it is where God finds you. If this video stirred something in you, a symbol, a dream, or simply the feeling that something deeper is calling, listen. You don't have to understand everything. You just have to be brave. As Jung once said, the way to the self is not a short path. It is a long pilgrimage, but its ultimate gift is this. You realize that you are, and have always been, the sacred place you were seeking. You do not need to search for God in the sky. You only need the courage to sit with your soul, and God will speak.